He was transported to the house by another. Not during the crime, but I was there afterwards and I watched the removal of the body.
You reached that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with them and just tell.
Number 5, Ruth Snyder. Ruth Snyder was an American woman who was fatally punished for the slaying of her husband, Albert Snyder, in 1928. The case was highly publicized at the time and became known as the crime of the century. Snyder was born in New York in 1895 and worked as a magazine editor. In 1925, she met and married Albert Snyder, a traveling salesman. The marriage was troubled from the beginning, and Snyder began an affair with a married corset salesman named Judd Gray. In 1927, Snyder and Gray began plotting to destroy Albert Snyder. They enlisted the help of a former employee of Snyder's named Henry Judd, who agreed to help them carry out the slaying. On March 20, 1927, Snyder and Gray went to the Snyder home and destroyed Albert Snyder with a sash weight. They staged the crime scene to make it look like a burglary had gone wrong. The slaying was initially believed to be a robbery, but suspicion soon fell on Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray. They were both arrested and put on trial for slaying. The trial was highly publicized, and newspapers covered every detail of the case. Despite their attempts to deny their involvement in the slaying, Snyder and Gray were found guilty and sentenced to their end. They were both fatally punished in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison on January 12, 1928. However, Snyder's punishment went quite wrong. As the electric current was applied, Snyder's body convulsed and jerked violently. Witnesses reported seeing smoke and flames coming from her head, indicating that the electrodes had been improperly placed or had malfunctioned. The punishment was stopped, and the prison officials attempted to revive Snyder, but she was pronounced deceased a few minutes later. The botched punishment of Ruth Snyder led to widespread criticism of the use of the electric chair. Number 4, Giuseppe Zangara. Zangara's assassination attempt was motivated by his anger and frustration with the economic situation in the U.S. at the time. Zangara was born in Calabria, Italy in 1900. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1923 and settled in Paterson, New Jersey. Zangara was unable to find steady employment during the Great Depression and became increasingly bitter and resentful about his situation. On the day of the assassination attempt, Roosevelt was giving a speech in Miami's Bayfront Park. Zangara positioned himself in the crowd, armed with a handgun. He fired 5 shots at Roosevelt, but none of the shots hit the president-elect. Instead, the shots struck several bystanders, including Chicago Mayor Anton Chernak, who was critically injured and later perished. Zangara was quickly apprehended and charged with attempted slaying. He was initially sentenced to 80 years in prison, but after Chernak's demise, Zangara was charged with the slaying and sentenced to his end. He expressed no remorse for his actions, stating that he had attempted to destroy Roosevelt because he believed that the president-elect was responsible for the country's economic woes. Zangara was punished by an electric chair on March 20, 1933. Number 3, Albert Fish. Albert Fish was an American serial slayer who was active during the 1920s and 30s. He was known for his sadistic and depraved crimes, which included the torture and slaying of young children. Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870 and had a difficult childhood. He experienced physical exploitation and was frequently exposed to religious fanaticism. These experiences had a profound effect on Fish's mental state, and he began to develop a fascination with sadomasochism and cannibalism. Fish's crimes began in earnest in the 1920s. He would often prey on young children, luring them away from their families with promises of money or candy. Once he had them in his grasp, he would exploit and then destroy them. He was also known to engage in cannibalism, consuming the flesh of his victims. Fish's crimes went undetected for years, but he was eventually caught in 1934 after the kidnapping and slaying of a young girl named Grace Budd. Fish had lured her away from her family under false pretenses, and he had sent her parents a letter detailing the gruesome details of her slaying. Fish was put on trial for the slaying of Grace Budd, and his trial was one of the most sensational of the era. He was known for his bizarre behavior, including his claims that he was being controlled by God and his tendency to burst into song in the middle of proceedings. Despite these antics, Fish was found guilty and sentenced to his demise. Fish's fatal punishment was carried out in 1936 by an electric chair. He showed no remorse for his crimes, even requesting that his final meal consisted of rare steak and onions, which he believed would help him maintain his virility in the afterlife. The case of Albert Fish remains one of the most shocking in American history. Fish's crimes were depraved and sadistic, and his behavior during his trial only added to the horror of the situation. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial assassin who was responsible for the ends of at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. Gacy was known for his outwardly charming personality, but he was hiding a dark and twisted secret. Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942 and had a troubled childhood. He was overweight and often bullied by his peers. Despite his difficulties, Gacy was able to achieve success as an adult. He was a successful businessman and even worked as a clown at children's parties. However, behind closed doors, Gacy was a predator. He would lure young men and boys to his home under the guise of offering them construction work. Once he had them in his grasp, he would sexually exploit and slaughter them. He would then bury their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. Gacy's crimes went undetected for years, but in 1978, a police search of his home uncovered the remains of several of his victims. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of slaying. Gacy's trial was a media sensation. He was known as the Slayer Clown, and his crimes shocked the nation.
He was transported to the house by another. Not during the crime, but I was there afterwards and I watched the removal of the body.
That body was put into the river?
It was taken to the river and dumped in the river.
Did you help do that?
If you want to charge me with anything, charge me with complicity in 2 of the murders. Robert Peace was killed by another individual in my home.
How did he get to your home?
I believe he was strangled.
During the trial, Gacy's defense team tried to argue that he was insane, but this was ultimately rejected. Gacy was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to his demise. Gacy's punishment was carried out by lethal injection in 1994. He was the 13th person to be punished in Illinois since the fatal penalty was reinstated in 1977. For his last meal, he requested a dozen fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe KFC chicken, French fries, and a pound of fresh strawberries. He also had a Diet Coke to drink. However, Illinois prison officials ended the tradition of offering special last meals to Enro inmates shortly after Gacy's passing, so subsequent inmates were not offered a last meal of their choice. Gacy's crimes remain some of the most shocking and heinous in American history, and they continue to fascinate and horrify people today. In addition to his crimes, Gacy is also known for his artwork. He was a prolific painter and would often create works depicting clowns and other circus-related themes. Some of his paintings have sold for tens of thousands of dollars despite the controversy surrounding their creator. The case of John Wayne Gacy serves as a reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly innocent facades. Gacy was able to deceive those around him for years, but his true nature eventually came to light. Number 1. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial slayers in American history. He was responsible for the ends of at least 30 young women and girls in the 1970s. Bundy was known for his good looks and charismatic personality, which helped him lure his victims. Bundy was born in Vermont in 1946, but he grew up in Tacoma, Washington. He had a troubled childhood, and his behavior was often erratic. As a young adult, he attended college in Washington and then moved to Utah to attend law school. It was during this time that he began his slaying spree. Bundy's first known victim was a young woman named Karen Sparks. She disappeared in January 1974, and her body was later found in the woods. Over the next few years, Bundy continued to target young women, many of whom resembled his ex-girlfriend. He would often approach them under the guise of being injured and in need of help. Once he had gained their trust, he would overpower them and take them to secluded areas where he would physically exploit and slay them.
You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with them and just tell. I grew up in a wonderful home with 2 dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. Gives you a greater sense of excitement until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. That basically I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum. Maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it. Once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder. I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life.
Bundy was finally caught in 1978 when he was pulled over for a routine traffic stop in Florida. The officer who pulled him over noticed that Bundy's car matched the description of a vehicle that had been seen near the scene of a recent abduction. When the officer searched the car, he found a ski mask, gloves, and other suspicious items. Bundy was arrested and charged with kidnapping and attempted slaying. Over the next few months, evidence began to mount against Bundy, and he was eventually charged with numerous counts of slaying. He was put on trial in Florida in 1979, and the trial was televised nationally, making it one of the first high-profile trials to be broadcast live. Bundy acted as his own attorney, which allowed him to cross-examine witnesses and argue his own case. Despite this, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to his end. Bundy's case continued to make headlines for years as he appealed his sentence and continued to deny his guilt. He even married one of his supporters while on the row.
I want to marry you, Carol. And I do want to marry you. Do you want to marry me?
Bundy finally met his end with an electric chair in 1989, more than a decade after his horrifying spree began.
And all this takes around 4 or 5 minutes, and to catch the dripping of the blood, a piece of cotton is placed under the mask which hides the face. The total time the defendant walks into after the condemned person is brought into the death chamber until he's pronounced officially dead is around 6 minutes. Death chamber from death row, and this is held also for about a minute. That's held for about a minute.
That's all for today, folks. See you next time.